Thanks for having me. Have you ever noticed or come across that lost child in a shopping mall or an amusement park? You know the one. You see that kid, and he has this expression on his face of just terror and panic. Tears are streaming down his eyes. And there's this particular look that a kid has when he's lost. I remember one time seeing a kid in this shopping mall, and he had that look on his face. He was about 5 or 6. No one was around. There were other people already coming up to him, but every face that came up to him was just further evidence that he didn't know where mom and dad were. And he was frantically looking to and fro, trying to see where his parents were. And as these well-meaning people are trying to help him, from afar, I just saw him lock eyes across the room, and he pointed, and he saw mom, and mom saw him, and she rushed forward, and she grabbed him, and immediately this disfigured, panicked face relaxed. The tears were still coming down, but it was okay again. This is what psychologists call affect regulation. When someone who's close to us, who we trust, shows up in the midst of our lostness, our confusion, our pain, and it doesn't change everything, but it changes everything for us. We're okay. And I think this experience of that lost child who sees mom, who sees dad, can give us a window into the book of Job. The book of Job is a very interesting reflection on the problem of pain and suffering. In fact, it's the earliest reflection on the problem of pain and suffering that we have in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Some scholars think that Job was actually the first book in the Bible that was written. And so what does Job teach us about pain and about suffering? Actually, I didn't want to go to that slide yet, but we'll get there. It can hang while we talk. One lesson that Job teaches us, and scholars will often point this out, is that Job never gets an answer to the why question. Job is constantly asking throughout the book, why is this happening to me? And one of the lessons we learn from the book of Job is that oftentimes we don't get an answer to that question. Job never finds out why it was happening. Now, the reader finds out why. We find out that God and Satan had this contest going, and Job was the pawn for the game. But even that answer to the why question leaves us with more questions. Why does God do this? Why was God in some sort of contest with Satan? What does he have to prove to Satan? So one of the lessons we get from the book of Job is that oftentimes we don't know why we suffer. Another lesson that the book of Job teaches us is that even when Job does get an answer from God, God's answer is, Job, you're not wise enough, you're not knowledgeable enough, you're too limited and finite in your understanding to understand what's going on. And so another lesson we learn from Job is that our perspective is oftentimes too limited. We don't really see what's going on in the big picture. But I think there's another lesson. And it's a lesson that's easy to miss in the book of Job. And we can find our way into it by paying very careful attention to Job's response to Yahweh when Yahweh shows up at the end. Because if you've ever paid attention to the story, Job considers just about every possible reason why he's suffering. And his friends help him out, and they think of ideas that he's not satisfied with either. Throughout the whole book, he's completely dissatisfied with every explanation of why he's suffering. But then notice what happens, because God shows up at the end, and frankly, God gives him one of those pretty superficial answers. God shows up and says, Job, where were you when I made everything? Who were you to address me? I am the wise one, Job. You know nothing. And the thing is, Job already knew that. Job himself said throughout the book, God, I know you're wise. I know your purposes I cannot fathom. And so why is it when God shows up and gives Job an answer that Job already knew, does this guy step down? Why does he acquiesce? Why is he satisfied? Job was quite willing to shake his fist at God, but somehow when God shows up, he says, I'm good. I'm okay. And I think that story of that lost child in the shopping mall can actually give us some insight into why Job is all right. You see, Job locks eyes with Yahweh. Job sees God come and he says, I'm good. In some respects, it doesn't matter what God says, it's that God said it. God shows up for Job and Job says, I'm okay now. Not everything's okay, but Job's okay. Job himself says it this way, my ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. I'm good. I don't need an answer anymore. You're here. Now this picture becomes relevant. One of the good things about being a parent is you get a chance to read your kids' children's literature. So for the second time, I did it with my oldest child, and now I'm doing it with my 8-year-old daughter, Sienna. I'm going through the Chronicles of Narnia. And right now we're reading The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And you notice something different every time, or at least I do. One of the things I've been paying attention to more as I'm reading the Chronicles of Narnia with my daughter is how often Aslan goes around breathing on people. Do you remember this from the story? He's always breathing on people. And when he breathes on people, they're like, they're okay, right? We just read the part of the story where Lucy is on the Dawn Treader, this boat, and they go into this darkness, and everyone's panicking, and Lucy cries out to Aslan, and she feels the breath of Aslan, and she relaxes. You see, that's what happened to Job. It was the breath of Aslan, the breath of God. Now, this is probably going to derail my whole talk, but I can't help it. You know, I was thinking about this analogy or this metaphor of the breath of Aslan, the breath of God. And I have a dog at home, and he breathes on me sometimes. And in fact, I spend most of my time at home trying to avoid my dog's breath, because he's all up in our faces, and he's this, and his breath is not something that's refreshing. And you know, I was even thinking about it with my wife. When I come home from work, I've never heard my wife say, honey, could you just breathe on me? I could really use your breath. So I was thinking, what is this? How come the breath of Aslan sounds so cool? Most people breathing and most animals breathing is not something I'm interested in. But I'll give C.S. Lewis a break there. There must be something different about the breath of Aslan, and no doubt the breath of God. But that's what Job experiences. He locks eyes with Yahweh across the room, and he's settled. His affect is regulated. Now, that's a nice thought. God shows up in our pain, and it doesn't change everything, but it changes everything for us. But you might be in pain, you might be in stress, and you might be saying, so where's Yahweh? Where's God? Why doesn't God show up more often? In fact, that's one of the experiences Job has. Job has the experience of, where are you, God, in the midst of this? In fact, one of the things we can learn from Job is how to wait for God to show up, how to wait for God in pain with Job. Because Yahweh doesn't show up right away. We don't know exactly how long it takes for God to show. We know it's at least a week, because Job's friends show up, and for a week they don't say anything. So we know it's at least a week, but some commentators think it's more like a month. There's one part in the book of Job where Job says, so am I made to possess months of vanity? There's another part in the book where it sounds like people are ostracizing him. They're not going over to his house. Some commentators think that Job waited perhaps more than a year before he had the encounter with God. So God doesn't show up right away for Job. He often doesn't show up right away for us either. Now, that's a whole nother question. Why doesn't God show up right away? But one thing to think about there is when God does show up, right, everything changes. Everything's different. And so sometimes it might be that God doesn't show up because something needs to happen in the darkness. Something needs to happen in the pain, perhaps for us, perhaps for someone else. But again, the Christian message is eventually Yahweh will show up, as Revelations 21 has it, he'll wipe every tear from our eye. Isn't that a beautiful image? It's not just that when we see God, we'll stop crying, or it's not that he'll say, stop crying, right? But he'll wipe every tear from our eye as that parent embraces the child and says, I know, it's okay. That's the ultimate Christian response to pain, is that God's going to show up. But what do we do in the meantime? How do we learn to wait for God in pain? Well, there's 3 practices in the book of Job that I want to talk about in the remaining time. The first practice is what I'm going to call the prayer of Job. Job prays a lot in the book of Job, but there's one particular prayer that stands out. It's a very courageous prayer. It's a very dangerous prayer. In the midst of Job's pain, he prays this: Lord, teach me to see what I still don't see. He's saying, God, help me to see what's going on here that I haven't seen yet. It's a very dangerous prayer. I don't know if you guys remember this. It was about 10 or so years ago. There was this prayer of Jabez. It kind of went like it was a bestseller. And the prayer of Jabez was something like, Lord, bless me and increase my land. The prayer of Job is not going to be a bestseller. This is a dangerous prayer. Because what you're asking God to do is, in the midst of your pain, in the midst of your stress, in the midst of whatever confusing circumstances you're going through, what you're saying is, God, help me to see what I'm not seeing here. Help me to see what you might be trying to show me in the midst of this. And chances are, what we'll see isn't something we really want to see, but it's something we might need to see. When my son was 3 years old, he was diagnosed with a medical condition that had lots of symptoms. It made him uncomfortable throughout most of the day. There was a lot of abdominal pain, and sometimes the pain would be quite excruciating. He wasn't able to participate in sports. We actually homeschooled him because we never knew when he would experience so much pain that he would have to pull himself out of a class or a sporting event. There were all sorts of things he couldn't do. He couldn't go on sleepovers. And this lasted for years and years and years. In fact, he's 11 now, and to some degree, he still struggles with it. The doctors knew what it was. They diagnosed it, but they said, unfortunately, there's not much you can do about it. It'll eventually go away. And we had some horrible times, my wife and I and my son, as we would sit with him in pain. And he would pray to God, God, take it away. And we would pray to God, God, take it away. And an hour, 2 hours later, he was still in excruciating pain. And somewhere in the midst of that, I said, Lord, teach me to see what I don't want to see. Teach me to see what I still don't yet see. And part of what God taught me through that is how much I flee from my own helplessness. Because when I was with my son, I felt helpless and I hated it. I want to fix the problem. I want to find a cure. And I tried really hard to do that for him, but I had to eventually trust God in my helplessness. I didn't like that, but it was a lesson I needed to learn. So whatever pain or struggle or trial you might be going through, you might want to practice the prayer of Job. Lord, teach me to see what I still don't see. The second practice is the practice of spiritual friendship. Job's friends get a bad rap, but for the first week, they were doing okay. They show up and they shut up. It's really amazing what the text says. It says, now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this adversity, they each came, one from his own place. All 3 of these friends came from different parts, and it sounds like they actually had to travel some to get there. We don't know the backstory of these friendships, but Job had these friends, and eventually a 4th friend joins, Elihu. Job had cultivated these friendships so that when he was in his ashes, his friends started walking towards him. And they showed up, and they shut up. The practice of spiritual friendship is covenanting with your friends to say, I want to be there in your ashes. And for them to covenant with you that they are going to show up in your ashes. Biola University is a great place to make these kinds of friendships. I know, because I was an undergrad here too. I lived down in Stewart Hall in the late 1980s. Thank you, Stewart Hall people. And I'll tell you, if you come to Panera Bread this Thursday morning at 6 a.m., you'll see me with Matt and with Ken and with Dennis. And these three guys I went to school with here at Biola, and for over 25 years now, we've met almost every week. And we show up in each other's ashes. We've covenanted with one another that whether life's going great or life's going bad, we're going to be there. We're going to get on a plane, we're going to get in the car, wherever we need to go to show up in each other's ashes. Have you covenanted with people to show up in their ashes? Have people covenanted with you to show up in your ashes? This is the practice of spiritual friendship. The third practice is the practice of lament. We know about lament from the scriptures. There's a long tradition in the scriptures of lament. The Psalms of lament, Lamentations, Jesus laments, my, why hast thou forsaken me? But Job is one of our best models of lament. Job does not hold back with God. At one place, he says, I'm going to argue my case before God. He never sins in his arguing. He never curses God, but he lets God have it. He gets angry with God. He shares his frustration and confusion and disorientation with God. And lament is a very powerful discipline when we're in pain because we move towards God in lament instead of moving away from him. I'm going to tell you a story about a friend of mine named Jeff Jensen. This is Jeff and his son Ben and his daughter Lauren and his little boy Nathan. And 2 years ago, Amy Jensen, Jeff's wife, their mother, she succumbed to a long battle with an aggressive form of brain cancer. And so now the Jensen family doesn't have mom. There's her tombstone. Wonder Woman is what they put on it. There's a backstory to that. I was talking to Jeff the other day, and it's been 2 years since Amy died. He said, I've been realizing something. In my anger, in my confusion, in my disorientation of why God allowed Amy to die. He said, I've used my anger as an excuse to move away from God instead of bringing my anger to God in lament. See, in lament, instead of saying, God, I don't trust you, I don't know what you're doing, I'm going to back away, we say, God, I don't trust you, I don't know what you're doing, what's going on? We move towards God because he can handle it. Lament is ultimately an exercise of trust. We trust God enough that he can take our grief, he can take our questions, he can take our anger. Now, I have to admit to you, I don't do lament very well. And so even preparing for this chapel, I thought, okay, I need to practice lament. I'm going to tell these guys to practice lament. I got to practice it. So I started thinking, okay, what am I kind of bugged about right now? And really, there's not a lot. I'm feeling pretty good about my life, and things are going okay. So I just picked something that was kind of a bit silly. I wasn't that upset about it, but I started to lament with God. I just want to practice it. I started saying, God, where are you in this? Why aren't you doing something? How come you're not doing this? How come you're not doing that? And as I expressed my more negative feelings towards God, it was actually a wonderful experience because I actually came to talk myself out of my lament and experience gratefulness to God. And so even when life is going good, we can practice lament. We can bring our deepest feelings of frustration or confusion into relationship with God. And so whether things are going great, or you're stressed out because of finals, or your car broke down, or there's relational distress in your life, or you have a grandparent that's sick, or you've lost someone recently, Job gives us these practices of waiting for God in the midst of pain. The practices of the prayer of Job. Lord, teach me to see what I still don't see. The practice of spiritual friendship. Showing up in people's ashes. I had some friends not too long ago. They were expecting their second child. And in their 8th month of pregnancy, she didn't feel the baby moving. And so she went to the doctor, and sure enough, they couldn't find the heartbeat. They determined the child had died in its 8th month of development. And later that day, she gave birth to their dead child. We got in the car and we showed up at the hospital. You know, we often say we don't know what to say in those situations. Well, it's because there isn't anything to say. You just show up and you just sit. A couple days later, they came home from the hospital and a group of us got together. We drove over to their house. We bought some candles. We lit them in their front yard and we just sat on their sidewalk. We called them before we were coming and we said, hey, we just want to let you know, a group of us are coming over. You don't have to come out. We don't want to come in. We just want to be there. See, that's spiritual friendship. You show up, you don't have to say anything. So as you're waiting for God to arrive in pain, who are your spiritual friends? Who are the people who are going to show up in your ashes today and who commit to you to show up in your ashes for the rest of your life? And then lastly, don't forget the practice of lament. God can handle your distress. He can handle your stress. You can talk to him about how tired you are, about how bummed out you are, about how confused you are. So Bible University, as you head into finals week and whatever the summer holds for you, my encouragement would be to learn from Job and to pray that prayer of Job, to make sure you're covenanting with others, and to lament.
Biola University prepares Christians to think biblically about everything, from science to business to education and the arts. Learn more at biola.edu.